Hi, my name is Jody Coles, and I'm the dietitian on the intensive rehab unit here at Health Sciences North. And today I would like to talk to you about the diet to help prevent strokes. I have two sessions that I do, one on high fiber and low fat eating, and I do a second one on low sodium eating. So I invite you to watch that presentation as well. But today we're going to talk about high fiber and low fat eating. And we're going to discuss how when you have risk factors for stroke, a healthy diet can help you to reduce your risk factors. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk a little bit about reading labels. So some of the risk factors for stroke that can be reduced by a healthy diet include if you've had a previous stroke, if you have high blood pressure, if you have cardiovascular disease, or also called hardening of the arteries, if you have high blood cholesterol or high triglycerides, which can also be called hyperlipidemia, and if you have diabetes. So these are all risk factors for stroke, and these can all be reduced by a healthy diet. So a healthy diet, of course, as I mentioned, is one that is high in fiber and low in fat. And so if we look at specifically what that means in terms of the foods we eat, this diet would be high in vegetables and fruit, which are naturally high in fiber and low in fat. High in whole grains, which again, these are foods that are naturally high in fiber and low in fat. Proteins from plant sources, which are also naturally high in fiber and low in fat. And also a diet that includes predominantly unsaturated fats. A healthy diet would also be one that is low in saturated fats, trans fats, and added sugars. So these are unnatural sugars, and also low in sodium. So in other words, your chance of stroke can go down when you eat more fruits and vegetables, more legumes or plant proteins, more fish, less saturated fat and trans fat, less sugar, especially the added unnatural sugars, and less sodium. So when we're thinking, well, what is this diet that can prevent a stroke? Believe it or not, it is simply our Canada's Food Guide, which was newly revised in 2019, along with a no added salt diet. So that portion of the diet to prevent stroke is the one that I'm going to talk more specifically about in the second presentation that I do. But for today, we're going to focus just on the Canada's Food Guide and the high fiber and low fat eating, and a little bit about the added sugars. Canada's Food Guide also encourages that we eat less processed foods. So those would include things like white bread, white noodles, and white rice. And of course, eating less added sugar, including very sweet, high-fat desserts. One of the things that our new Canada's Food Guide introduced that is different from any other Canada's Food Guide that we've had in the past is the use of the plate method for portioning food. And also, they went away from the 4 food groups and reduced it down into 3 food groups. And in order to do that, what they did was they combined the meat and alternate groups and the dairy group together into one. And they call it now the protein food group. We still have our fruits and vegetable group, and we still have our grain group. And with the plate method, they presented it in a way that helps you to know how much of these foods to be eating without measuring foods. So in the past, our Canada's Food Guide did always give guidelines on measurements of foods and portions and that kind of thing. And now they've gone away from using specific measurements such as cups and tablespoons and so on, and they're just using your plate as a way to measure. So as you can see here, we have vegetables and fruit being half of your plate, your protein foods being a quarter, and your grains being the other quarter of your plate. So let's talk a little bit about the vegetables. So this is the largest portion of your plate, half of it. Now, something I want to point out is that even though in the picture here, there are actually some potatoes, the intention is not that you would have half a plate of potatoes. So if you're having potatoes with your meal, and I know there's lots of people out there who love their potatoes and would be happy to have half a plate, really nutritionally speaking, potatoes are more in line with our grain products. And so if we are having them, they should really only include about a quarter of your plate. And still half of your plate should be other vegetables. So anything you like, be that greens or broccoli, beans, whatever you happen to like. Fresh vegetables and frozen vegetables are fine. Some people really think that frozen are not as good, but actually they're quite good because they're frozen soon after being harvested, and so they retain a lot of the nutrients that fresh vegetables don't. As fresh vegetables sit at the grocery store day after day, they actually lose some of their nutrient content. They are still great, but certainly don't be afraid to use frozen vegetables and fruit. Also, it's best to eat the fruits and vegetables in their natural form. So not in a juice form, in their whole form. This way you get the fiber that's in the fruit and the vegetable. And the more colorful your plate, the better. So all different colors of vegetables and fruits. Moving on to grain products. So this is a quarter of your plate. Now, what Canada's Food Guide is emphasizing, and what we would certainly emphasize for anybody, but especially anybody who's trying to prevent a stroke, is to emphasize whole grains at least half of the time. So whole grains, I'm going to show another slide in a moment here that really describes what whole grains are as opposed to refined grains. But they are the grain in its closest form to having been harvested, so not refined. And there are a lot of whole grains out there. And if you're looking at the packaging on a food item, you can tell, first of all, usually by the color of the grain. So if it's bread or pasta, for example, it will be darker in brown color and not white if it is a whole grain. But also on the packaging, there is a little stamp, and I have a picture of it here in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. It's a little yellow stamp that says 100% whole grain. And you would see that on any food product, any packaged food product that contains 100% whole grains. So you want to look for this. But you will see it, for example, on oatmeal. You will see it on all different kinds of rice, black rice, brown rice, red rice, wild rice, all your whole wheat, whole grain pastas, barley, but specifically pot barley. So pearl barley is a little bit refined. So pot barley is the form of barley that is more natural, closest to its harvested form. Corn and popcorn and flaxseed. Ground flaxseed is easier for us to digest than the actual flax seeds, but both are, of course, a whole grain. And then high fiber cereals are another great source of whole grains. So looking at what really the difference is between a whole grain and a refined grain, in this picture here on the left, you'll see a diagram of the whole grain kernel, which includes 3 different portions. So there's the bran portion of the grain, which is the outer layer. And then there is the inside of it, which is called the endosperm. And then there is also the germ. What happens when grains are refined is they remove in processing the bran and often the germ. And so you are only left with the endosperm portion of the grain. And that is what makes it white because you've removed the portions of the grain kernel that give it the color, but you have also removed the highest source of fiber and vitamins and minerals when the bran and germ are removed. When you're just left with the endosperm, you're just left with pretty much the carbohydrate or the starchy containing portion of the grain. So some other examples of whole grains too that I didn't mention, one is quinoa. That's very popular right now, and it's very good as well. So moving on to protein foods. So again, we want to emphasize plant-based proteins and lean meats. So this doesn't mean that you need to become vegetarian or vegan, but it's just a message that Canada's Food Guide is sending to try to include more plant-based proteins in our diet. So these include such things as dried beans, split peas, lentils, soy products such as tofu and soy milk, nut butters. The most popular ones right now are, of course, peanut butter, and almond butter is quite easily found. And then nuts and seeds. It is recommended, though, that you only have about 1/4 cup of nuts or seeds per day because they do contain quite a bit of fat. It's a healthy fat. It's that unsaturated fat, but it is nonetheless a high fat containing food. Lean animal sources of protein would include fish and shellfish, skinless poultry, so chicken and turkey with the skin removed, lean beef, lean pork, and what is the key here is actually the portion size that you use. So what you want to aim for is a portion that is about the size of a deck of cards. That's about 3 ounces of meat. And lean animal sources of protein also include our eggs and our dairy products. So for fish, just to give you an idea of how fish can reduce your risk of stroke, there have been a few studies done. And what they have found is that for women, if women eat fish 1 to 4 times per week, they can reduce the risk of stroke by 25 to 50%. For men, if they eat fish just 1 to 3 times per month, they can reduce the risk of stroke by up to 40%. So that's quite significant. Now, the types of fish do need to be a fatty fish. So the best ones in this category are salmon, tuna, trout, mackerel, anchovies, sardines and smelts, and herring. That's not to say that all other types of fish are not worth eating. They certainly are. So enjoy your pickerel and your bass and those kinds of things. But definitely try to be having the fattier fish as many times a week as possible. The other protein foods, so milk products, with choosing dairy products, it is important to try to choose lower fat dairy products. So it doesn't mean that you have to have 0% fat, but if you can pick dairy products that are 1% or 2% milk fat, I'm going to show you a label, I think on the next slide here, so you can see where that is found on the food product. But those are considered low fat as well. It doesn't have to be 0%. So this would be your milk, any kind of cheese that you're using, and yogurt. Fortified soy milk is another great alternative for cow's milk if you wanted to try it. It has a very good protein content comparable to cow's milk, and it's actually not too bad. You have to give it a try. It would take some getting used to, but it's not too bad. There are a lot of other alternate milks out there right now as well. The ones that are most popular right now are almond milk, oat milk, and rice milk. The only thing about them is that they don't have the protein content that soy milk and definitely cow's milk have. So they are good to use, but if you are really struggling to keep your protein content up in your diet, then soy milk would be a better choice for you than almond or oat milk or rice milk. Okay, now here's the slide where we're going to try to look at the labels here. Now, when you're looking at the fat content for dairy products, you don't need to look at the nutrition panel. The fat content is actually right on the main label of dairy products, and they call it milk fat. So you'll see a percentage, and then you'll see the letters MF right beside it. So if we look at the picture of the Black Diamond cheese slices in the top left-hand corner, the print is kind of small, but it's right under the French wording for natural cheese slices. It says 32%, and then there's a tiny little MF beside it. So that is the milk fat content. That is what you're looking for when you're looking at a dairy product. And what we want to shoot for is less than 20% when you're looking at cheese. When you're looking at milk and yogurt and so on, as I mentioned, less than 2%, 1 or 2% is great. And this example of a yogurt label is really very obvious. It's quite large, 2%. And down in the bottom of the container where it says the weight of the product, so 750 grams, right beside that, you'll also see the 2% MF. And that's usually how you'll see it on a food product. You don't usually see it nice and big like that 2%. And on the bottom example of the light Black Diamond cheese, so the print is too small here for you to see on the slide, but it should be less than 20% milk fat as a light cheese product. So that's a way to identify them as well without having to see the milk fat content, just seeing the light labeling. All right, so we're going to move on to fiber and fat and added sugar. And with fiber, for everybody, we're trying to get at least 25 to 35 grams a day of fiber. Fiber comes in two forms, soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. They are both good for you, and they're in all types of foods. But just to give you information about them, soluble fiber can help to lower your bad cholesterol. So you may have heard that we have different types of cholesterol in our blood. We have good cholesterol, which is called HDL. We have bad cholesterol, which is called LDL. And soluble fiber can help to lower the bad cholesterol in your blood. Fiber also gives you a feeling of fullness. So when you're having a meal that has a lot of fiber in it, you're probably going to eat less because you feel full from all of the fiber in the fruits and vegetables and the whole grains. Fiber can also help control your blood sugar levels. So for people who have diabetes, it's really important to try to get enough fiber in your diet, at least the 25 to 35 grams per day. But if you can get up to 50 grams of fiber in your diet per day, that would really help to control blood sugar levels. So some examples of insoluble fiber would be bran cereals, whole grains, and vegetables and fruit. Soluble fibers are found in your legumes, so in your dried beans, your peas, your lentils, but also in oats and oat bran and barley. Moving on to fats, there are, of course, healthy fats and then less healthy fats. And what we want to eat less of are, of course, the less healthy ones, which are the saturated fats and the trans fats. And we want to try to eat more of the unsaturated fats. So saturated fats are fats that are solid at room temperature. So these are things like lard, butter, coconut oil, the fat that you find in meat. Saturated fats are only found in animal products or in tropical oils. So coconut oil and palm oil, as an example, are also saturated fats because when they are sitting on your counter at room temperature, they are solid. These types of fats increase the bad cholesterol in your blood. And so this is why we want to try to reduce them as much as possible. Trans fats are not a naturally occurring fat. They are a fat that are created in the processing of food. So when oils are used in processed foods, they can turn them into a solid fat by a process called hydrogenation. And in this process, trans fats are created. And trans fats will increase not only the bad cholesterol in our blood, but it will also decrease the good cholesterol. So trans fats are really not a good thing. They are found in things like shortening, margarines, deep fried and packaged processed foods. So things like cookies that you would buy at the store, cookies and crackers, certainly processed prepackaged meals like your TV dinners, those types of things. Unsaturated fats are fats that are liquid at room temperature. So these would include your oils, all your vegetable oils. They include fats that you find in nuts and seeds. And what these fats do is they can reduce the bad cholesterol in your blood, and they may also increase the good cholesterol, and they decrease your triglycerides. So unsaturated fats are a very good thing to try to increase in your diet. So to give you kind of a list of where these types of fats are found and which ones we need to try to eat more of, the healthier fats, so these are foods that would contain more unsaturated fats. Fish, as I mentioned, so salmon, trout, tuna. Eggs, we now have the option to buy eggs that are fortified with omega-3 fatty acids. So if you can find these in the grocery store, they are a very good choice. Nuts, such as almonds, peanuts, pecans, walnuts, all different kinds of nuts and seeds as well. Oils, so all of your plant oils, canola oil, olive oil, corn oil, avocado oil, those all contain the healthy unsaturated fats. And then if you use margarine, use a non-hydrogenated margarine. So an example of a brand that is a non-hydrogenated margarine is Baicel. Less healthy fats, so these are the ones that contain more saturated or trans fats, are again your fried foods and processed foods. The tropical oils such as palm oil and coconut oil, and right now there is quite a lot of information out there promoting coconut oil. And so it's just to caution you that yes, it can be a good oil, but it is also a saturated oil. So you still need to watch the amount that you use. Red meat and pork, whole milks, high-fat cheese and cream, butter and cream cheese, ice cream, and sour cream. So all of these things will contain saturated fats. But if you watch the milk fat content, so if you're choosing, for example, the dairy products with the lower milk fat content, then you're going to reduce your saturated fat intake. And if you're watching the portions of the meats, for example, that contain saturated fat, then you will be reducing your intake there as well. With respect to cholesterol, there used to be, years ago, quite a lot of talk about cholesterol and trying to avoid cholesterol in our food as a way of controlling our blood cholesterol. And what they have found since then is that the cholesterol in food actually has very little impact on our blood cholesterol levels, but rather it's the saturated fats and the trans fats that do impact the cholesterol levels in our blood. So we want to reduce saturated and trans fats and not worry so much about looking for the cholesterol content in our foods. Our blood cholesterol levels are more dependent upon our genetics, whether or not we have diabetes, and what kind of physical activity we do. As I mentioned before, I think cholesterol is only found in animal products, and focusing on reducing your saturated fat and your trans fat is going to help reduce your blood cholesterol as opposed to focusing on the cholesterol in your diet. Increasing fiber intake also will help you to reduce your blood cholesterol levels. So let's talk a little bit about sugar. And it's specifically added sugar that Canada's Food Guide and the Diet to Prevent Stroke is focusing on. So sugar, when you're looking at the label of a food item, it can come in many different forms. So it may just say plain old sugar if you're looking at the ingredients, but you may see other things in the ingredients list, such as cane sugar, honey, molasses, different syrups, or words that end in OSE. So fructose and sucrose are examples of those. So when you see those words in ingredients, that's an indication that there is sugar added into the food. So why is this a problem? It's a problem because we know that a lot of added sugar can increase our blood triglyceride level. It can also decrease our good cholesterol in our blood. It can increase our blood pressure, and it can increase inflammation in our body. It can also contribute to weight gain. So what does a diet look like that has no sugar in it? Essentially, it's a diet that consists of whole foods, foods in their natural form, with no processed food, no packaged food. That's where you're going to see most of your added sugar. The natural sugars in your vegetables and your fruit are not as big of a concern as the added sugars. And so that is why the emphasis is on avoiding those processed products and not so much about watching your fruit and vegetable intake. So on the nutrition label, what you would be looking for under the grams of sugar is how much is there. So if there is less than 5 grams of sugar in a serving size, that's not very much at all. So you don't need to worry about that. If it is over 5 grams of sugar per serving size, then what you want to do is check the ingredients. And if in the ingredients you see any of those words that I mentioned in the previous slide, then you know that there has been sugar added to the product. And so these are the ones that you want to choose less often, or just watch your portion sizes of them. If you don't see any sugar listed in the ingredients, so it's on the label, you see there's sugar in there, but there is nothing in the ingredients to indicate that sugar has been added in, then the sugar content that is listed is just a natural sugar that is naturally occurring in the food. Nothing has been added. So those sugars are the ones you don't have to worry about as much. But I will just make a disclaimer here for people who have diabetes. You do need to watch your portion, even of natural sugars. So if we look at a food label here, I'm going to try to describe as best I can the fat content, or what we would look for, what is concerning, as well as the sugar. So if you look at the label on the left-hand side, you can see that they list the total fat. But what you want to look for really is how much trans fat and saturated fat are in those products. So here we have a total of 8 grams of fat, but in it, there are only 1 gram of saturated fat, and there is no trans fat in that product. So that means that the majority of the fat is an unsaturated fat. And so that is a good product to choose. If you look on the same label, the sugar content, so you would see that the sugars listed there, there's only 1 gram of sugar. So that's less than 5 grams. So I can't remember what this is a label for, but this is a very good food. It doesn't have any trans fat. It is very low in saturated fat. And the tiny amount of sugar that is in there is not something that you would need to worry about. It also has 4 grams of fiber. That's a pretty good fiber content. So looking at the label on the right-hand side, so again, there's not a concern with the fat content here. There's no trans fat in it. It's very low in saturated fat. But the sugar content, so there are 12 grams of sugar in this particular product, and they've actually listed here the added sugars too. So this is a new thing that we might start to see more of. There are 10 grams of added sugars in that. So 10 out of the 12 grams are an added sugar. So this would be a product that you would want to not eat very often, or eat very little of, or choose something else. If you were to look in the ingredient listing of this particular product, you would probably see something that indicates sugar has been added in, probably fairly high up on the ingredient list. Okay, but if reading labels is too confusing, which it can be, sometimes it's just overwhelming, you know, and it's hard to make sense of the information. Just try following some of these tips, and I'm just going to summarize here what I've talked about in the presentation. So if you follow some of these tips, now I've talked about a lot of different things today, and by no means do you need to do everything. If you can pick out of what I've talked about today, you know, a couple of things that you think you can change in your diet, then you're going to be doing a good thing that can help reduce your risk of stroke. You don't have to do everything. And in fact, if you try to do everything, it might become too overwhelming, and then you may not be able to continue with it for very long. So choose some things that you think you can do and try those out. And if you feel like you can add in a few more changes down the road, then that's a good way to try to slowly change your diet. So some of these things would include eating fish or seafood at least 3 times a week. But this would be not a deep fried fish. This would be a fish that you bake in the oven or do on the barbecue, something like that. Use small amounts of healthier fats, such as canola oil, olive oil, peanut oil, or sesame oil when you are cooking or when you're having a salad. Adding small amounts of nuts to stir fries and salads, or having nuts as a snack. When you're having meat, eat lean meat and smaller amounts of meat. So again, about the size of that deck of cards. When you're using hamburger, after you cook the hamburger, drain it, and you can even rinse it with hot water after you've cooked it, and that removes a lot of the fat. In fact, if you're using a lean ground meat and you drain it and rinse it after you've cooked it, you've reduced the fat content down to that of an extra lean ground beef. Eating meat only 2 to 3 times per week and eating plant proteins instead. Trimming off the fat and removing the skin from your meat. Using omega-3 rich eggs instead of regular eggs. Using a non-hydrogenated margarine such as Becel or Olivina, and using oils rather than hard fats such as your butters and your tropical oils. Replacing some of the oil in muffins and cakes with unsweetened applesauce. And lastly, replacing some of the oil in recipes with low sodium broth. So for example, if you're sauteing vegetables, and you would usually do that with oil, you can saute them with a bit of broth, or even just a bit of water will do the trick too if you have a non-stick pan. I often get questions about eating out. People don't know what to do when they're at a restaurant and they're trying to follow these diet guidelines for reducing stroke. So some of the things that you can do are skipping the appetizers. There are often a lot of calories and a lot of fat in many appetizers at restaurants. Ask for water to drink. Ask for all of your dressings and sauces to be on the side. Choose a garden salad or the cooked vegetable as your side dish instead of fries. Choose fish or try a vegetarian dish instead of your regular meat dish. If you're having pasta, choose a pasta that has a tomato sauce and vegetables instead of one that has a cream sauce. If you're having a hamburger, choose a plain burger instead of the house specialty. Ask for smaller portions. Restaurants don't mind giving you smaller portions. Or share with somebody. Often the meals are large, especially if you're older and you don't have a great appetite. You can definitely share your portion at a restaurant. And skip the dessert or share the dessert. If you're interested in individual nutrition counseling, for individuals who have diabetes, you can definitely get that from your local diabetes education center. And often you can just self-refer yourself. You don't need a doctor's referral for that. Outpatient nutrition counseling is also another option. I know here in Sudbury that does require a physician's referral. I've also got a couple of suggestions here for good magazines where you can get some good recipes. And then I've listed on the last slide some websites where you can also get good information about the diet for reducing your risk of stroke. And there are many, many websites out there where you can get a lot of really good recipes for plant-based eating or vegetarian eating.
Oh, sorry.
And that's all. I thank you very much, and I invite you to watch my presentation on low sodium eating as well. Thank you.